All right, so let's put it all together and talk about kind of the different zones, right? So, part of what I'm trying to avoid is I'm trying to avoid teaching you just one type of economic thought, right? Because if I teach you to be a hammer, what's going to happen? You're going to see everything as a nail. But if I teach you to be more of a Swiss Army knife and kind of think things through in terms of the context or think things through situationally, then perhaps you'll be more diverse and you'll be able to handle the kinds of economic conundrums that you're going to encounter in your life with, just greater efficiency and effectiveness, right? So that being said, we're going to talk about how. So let's give our setup here. We got a long run aggregate supply curve. That's a straight line. We label this also as our YP, right? Our full employment or our potential GDP. We've got a very convex, not convex enough, curve here. Almost. There we go. And then we're going to do, instead of one aggregate demand curves, we're going to talk about the different situations we may find ourselves in, right? So we talked at the beginning of this chapter about Keynes's law and Say's law, right? And how Keynes's law says that aggregate demand creates its own supply. Say's law says supply creates its own demand. And so the Keynesian zone is going to be down here, where we are pretty far away from our long run aggregate supply, right? From our potential GDP or our full employment GDP. So this right here, we're going to call our PK. So when the price levels are down here, and when the real GDP is down here, we're in the Keynesian zone, right? And we are better off to stimulate aggregate demand rather than try to shift aggregate supply as a way to get us to the long run aggregate supply curve, right? We see that this aggregate demand doesn't even cross the long run aggregate supply curve. So there's literally no way that the aggregate supply can do the gymnastics necessary in order to get the equilibrium, any further really than right here, right? So this is our Keynesian zone. When we're in the Keynesian zone and prices are depressed or disinflating, right? So again, we're not getting deflation. We're not getting actual decreases in the price, but maybe prices are only increasing by 1% instead of 2%. And when economic activity is so far below our potential, we're in the Keynesian zone. Now compare the Keynesian zone with if we are, so pay close attention to the slope of the short run aggregate supply. It would also help if I labeled the short run aggregate supply, right? But this slope of the short run aggregate supply, right? It is so mild here, down here, when we're in the Keynesian zone. Now, once we get over here where we're closer to our potential GDP, now we've got a much steeper slope, right? Greater than 1. There's probably, 2 rises for every 1 run in that particular slope. So our slope is increasing here, right? Which is inherently our trade-off between price level and real GDP. And so when we get to this point, and our aggregate demand is on top of our potential GDP, we're going to call this our neoclassical zone. In these circumstances, any stimulation of aggregate demand is going to have an outsized impact on price level, very large increase in price level with very small increases in actual GDP. So when we're in the neoclassical zone, supply is going to be the thing that drives the bus, more so than when we're in the Keynesian zone, where demand is the thing that is driving the bus, and demand is the thing that we need to stimulate. So over here, we're at a place where prices are much higher, and economic activity is, again, on top of, close to, perhaps even surpassing our potential GDP. All right, so what lies in between? Well, what lies in between is the in-between, right? The upside down. Aggregate demand of the intermediate zone. So when we're in the intermediate zone, there's a portion of the short-run aggregate curve where the GDP is below the potential GDP, right? But not so far as the Keynesians. So this short-run aggregate supply curve here is still upward sloping, but it's also not nearly as upward sloping as the short-run aggregate supply curve is when we're in the neoclassical zone. So in the intermediate zone, a mixture of both demand policies and supply policies could be appropriate. So shifting the demand to the right is going to get us closer to our potential GDP. That's going to reduce our unemployment, right? We can always think about this gap here. Our recessionary gap is also the amount of unemployment we have. So if we had a shift of aggregate demand to the right, that gap would decrease. That means unemployment is going to decrease. But what's that also going to do when we shift to the right? We're going to have a higher price level than before, and we're going to have greater output. Questions on the three zones of the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. We're going to jump into this Keynesian zone in chapter 12. Then we're going to do our neoclassical zone in chapter 13. And that's pretty much it. Questions?